Our epistle lesson this morning is Romans 8:24 through 28. We were saved in hope. If we see what we hope for, that isn't hope. Who hopes for what they already see? But if we hope for what we don't see, we wait for it with patience. In the same way, the Spirit comes to help our weakness. We don't know that what we should pray, but the Spirit himself pleads our case with unexpressed groans. The one who searches hearts knows how the Spirit thinks, because he pleads for the saints, consistent with God's will. We know that God works all things together for good for the ones who love God, for those who call according to his purpose. Our focus verse is Romans 8:28. We know that God works all things together for God, for the ones who love God, for those who are called according to his will. And people of God, blessed being to the people of God. And people's God say, amen.
Friends, let's pray together. Gracious God, we thank you for the way that you call us, the way that you give us hope, and the way that you lead us. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in your sight. For you alone are our rock, our strength, and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, friends, we are excited today to start a brand new sermon series for the rest of August and the first week in September. We're going to be doing a new series called The Game of Life. And we're going to be using traditional board games in order to teach us and let us see lessons that come on how we can play life God's way. So we're going to start today with The Game of Life. Next week, we're going to look at Scrabble, and then Trivial Pursuit, and then Monopoly. Now, have any of you ever played the board game, The Game of Life? Any hands? Oh, more than I would have thought. It is an exceedingly complicated game to play. I don't know if you've ever tried to play it with younger children. When I got out the instructions to read, it was 6 pages of instructions just on how to get the game set up and going. What'd somebody say? It's not easy over here? Yes. It's a difficult, complicated game. In that way, it is very much like life. So it's an appropriately named game for us to play. But if you play the game of life, you know that there are some places where you can choose and you can make choices. Anybody know what are the first 2 choices that you have to make? That's it. College or career. Those are your first 2 choices. And the career path is shorter on the board, but you don't make as much money. The college path takes longer, but you have a lot more debt that you incur, just like real life, when you choose that college path. And so there are some cards that you can draw, and you can choose whether to do what those cards say. There are some spaces that you land on, though, that you have to do what that space says. If you land on the space that says tax money, you've got to pay your accountant your tax money. If you land on car accident, then you've got to pay $5,000 to the insurance company. If you land on the get married tab, guess what? You've got to get married. So just like in real life, the game of life, that board game, offers us a glimpse and an insight into what it's like to have choices made for us and for us to make our own choices, but then have to live into the consequences and into the reality of the things that life throws at us. And so we, as people of faith, or perhaps people who have questions about faith, or maybe even people who struggle with faith, we are curious, not in board games, but in real life. Where is God in all of this? Where is God when things go wrong? Does God cause bad things to happen to us? Does God test us for some reason? Why do some people seem to get everything that they want and everything they need without having to work hard. And some of us who try our very best and make all the right choices keep getting knocked down again and again and again. So today we're going to learn through the game of life our lesson that is simple to say, but it is harder to live. God is always present, and God works all things together for good. God is always present, and God works all things together for good, for good. Now that is easier to say than it is to believe, isn't it? We've all been in that spot before. Some of you may be in that place right now. Maybe you're in that same spot where circumstances that are out of your control, that you desperately want to change, you want to see something turn around in your life, and despite all of your effort, despite all of your prayers, despite all of your striving, nothing is going the way that you want it to go. It may feel like God has turned a deaf ear to you, like God has left you alone down in a pit, that no matter what you want, nothing seems to be working out. It's like God has left the building. I was in that spot 13 years ago when I graduated from seminary. I seemed to have everything that I would have wanted in life. I was getting ready to be a minister. I wanted to be a pastor from the time that I was in the 4th grade. I shared some of that story last week. And I was already there. It was my last year in seminary. That dream was ready to be fulfilled. I was a missionary after college and literally had the chance to travel the world. I had lived alone in one of the most exciting cities in Philadelphia. As a young adult, I was married, and I had a little boy. Jackson, who's taller than me now, was just 14 months old at the time. And I seemed to have everything I had worked for. But the one thing that I wanted to do desperately, more than I had ever wanted anything in my whole life, was to be a stay-at-home mom. I had loved being a mother. I wanted to have more children, and I wanted to be able to stay home with Jackson and any future children that we had. But Mike's company had just closed, and he'd been laid off from his job. And try as he might, the tech bubble had just burst in the early 2000s, and jobs were shrinking in Philadelphia instead of growing, and he was having a difficult time finding a job in his field. And so I started to pray. I prayed earnestly for him to find a job. I started looking around at the tiniest apartments that I could find in Philadelphia because we only needed one bedroom. That's all I wanted for us to be able to live in. He would go to job interviews, and I would go with him and sit in the car and pray in the parking lot during that job interview. I traveled 3 hours each way to seminary, and I prayed that he would get a job in the car for that job interview. We were able to make it on our savings and on a student loan that I had for my last year of seminary, but that time was coming when I was going to have to make a decision. Was I going to go and take a church and become a pastor, or was I going to be able to stay home if my husband got a job? It was a tough, tough time. And it was at that time in my life that I was drawn to this passage from Romans, this passage that we just read. And I just want to read a couple verses again of that I think are so meaningful. The one who searches hearts knows how the Spirit thinks, because he pleads for the saints, consistent with God's will. We know that God works all things together for good, for the ones who love God, for those who are called according to his purpose. For we know that God works all things together for those who are called according to his purpose. If you look throughout Scripture, we can see time and time again where people of faith seem to have been forgotten or abandoned by God, who have deep desires and deep longings that God does not seem to be hearing their cries or responding to their needs. We saw that last week with Hannah. We looked at the person of Hannah and how she had cried out to God year after year after year to give her a child. I look also at the person of Joseph in Genesis, that very first book of the Bible, and I encourage you to go and read that story of Joseph. It's about a third of the book of Genesis. For if you look at his life, it seems like time and time again he was forgotten and abandoned and ignored by God. And yet throughout his life, God was using all things working together for good. Joseph was given this amazing gift by God to be able to interpret dreams. It was a God-given gift. And Joseph liked to tell his brothers about the dreams that he had and about how those dreams showed that Joseph was going to be the leader over all of his brothers. This would have been fine except for the fact that Joseph was the 11th child out of 11 boys. Anybody ever had an older brother in the room? Few older brothers? How do older brothers treat little brothers? Not, are they gentle and kind with them? No. In general, older brothers are not always gentle and kind, and they were that same way with Joseph, especially when Joseph said, "You may think you have all the power now, but just wait, I'm going to be the one who's in charge." And so Joseph's brothers did not like that. They didn't like it so much that they took Joseph and they sold him to slave traders. They human trafficked Joseph. They then took the coat that his father had given him, this beautiful coat, because he was the preferred son. They dipped it in blood and they took it back to his dad and said, "I'm so sorry. Our brother was killed by a wild animal. This is all that's left." And so there began Joseph's series of disasters, series of times where it seemed like he was abandoned by God. He was taken off by these slave traders and sold in Egypt. He was sold to a high-ranking official, Potiphar, in the Egyptian government, where God favored him and blessed him, and he rose up through the ranks to be the household leader there. And then Potiphar's wife took a liking to Joseph in the way that married women should not take likings to other people. And so she propositioned him, and when he turned her down, she accused him of assault and had Joseph thrown into prison, where he sat there for years. But again, God favored him, and he rose up through the ranks, even as he was imprisoned, until he was over all of the prisoners. And two of them, who were servants in the Pharaoh's household, had dreams that Joseph then interpreted. And one of them, he interpreted the dream that that servant would be restored. The other servant was told that he was going to die. And I want to read to you out of Genesis 40. The third day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a party for all of his servants. Before all of his servants, he gave an audience to the chief wine steward, the one who Joseph said was going to live, and the chief baker. He returned the chief wine steward to his position, just like Joseph had interpreted that dream, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But the chief baker, he hanged, just as Joseph said would happen when he interpreted their dreams for them. And the chief wine steward had promised Joseph that if he got back into the Pharaoh's household, he would remember Joseph and bring him out of prison. But verse 23, but the chief wine steward did not remember Joseph. He forgot all about him. Imagine how Joseph felt. So close he had been to gaining his freedom, so close he had been to living the life that he wanted, so close he was to being returned and restored to a full and complete life, only to be forgotten again. And yet there was that promise that God was always present and that God works all things together for good. Well, 2 years later, Pharaoh had a dream. And that chief wine steward said, "Hey, I know a guy who can interpret that dream for you." And so Joseph was able to interpret the dream. Pharaoh set him over all of Egypt. He was second in command over the entire country. And Joseph saved the country from famine. And when Israel also fell into famine, his brothers came to him. And whereas most of us, if our brothers had sold us into slavery, if we had been condemned to prison, if we had been forgotten all about, we would have sent our brothers away. But not Joseph. Joseph remembered God's promises. Joseph forgave his brothers, gave food to his brothers and all of their family, and saved them. What started with being sold into slavery ended with being restored to power and saving an entire geographic area. Because God is always present, and God works all things together for good. We've seen that this week in the Olympics. I've been Olympics obsessed, and some of you may also have seen some of the stories about the athletes that have emerged, athletes who have overcome incredible odds in order to just even get to the games. You may have heard the story about Yusra Mardini. She was a Syrian swimmer. This year, for the first time, the Olympics Committee put together a team of refugees, 10 refugees from all over the world who compete under the Olympic flag. And Yusra has become the face of that team. She's a swimmer. She was training in Damascus in Syria for the Olympics in 2020. But the bombs started to fall. And first her pool was bombed, then her home was bombed. Her city all around her was being destroyed. And so her parents saw that there was little choice but for them to send Yusra and her older sister to flee, trying to safely make their way to Europe. And so as Yusra and her sister set off on this journey, they came to one point where they had to cross the ocean in order to get to Greece. And so the traffickers piled 19 refugees onto a little inflatable raft that would only hold 6. 30 minutes into their journey, the motor stopped working. And that little tiny raft full of people started to take on water. Yusra, who is 17, and her sister got out of the raft into the cold water and pushed that raft 3.5 hours, saving the life of every person who was there. When she finally made it to a refugee camp in Germany, she asked where there was a local pool. They sent her on to the German equivalent of the YMCA, where she then started swimming. And a coach saw her and saw her potential, and the rest is history. God works all things together for good. There's another athlete whose story moved me so. The first Brazilian gold medalist of these games, her name is Rafaela Silva, and she competed in judo. Judo, as you may have known or seen, is a very aggressive type of sport. It looks very much like a hand-to-hand combat and fighting. It's an appropriate game because Rafaela grew up in the favela, or the slum area known as the City of God. In Rio de Janeiro, it's the largest of those slums, and it's the most dangerous. It's filled with human traffickers, with drug traffickers, with gangs, and with violence. And Rafaela's family did not want her to fall prey to that same type of life. And so they enrolled her in judo as a way to get her away from the gangs, a way to get her away from the violence, and to try and offer her a new life. Rafaela had to literally fight her way out of her surroundings, out of poverty, out of racism, out of oppression, in order now to become a hero in her country. God works all things together for good, for God is always present. Friends, sometimes when we are sitting in our own pits, when we are sitting in our own jails, we cannot see what God is doing. We may feel like God has abandoned us, like God has closed God's ears to us, and we may wonder if we will ever feel happiness or joy or wholeness or be welcome again. Yet we have this promise. God is always present, and God works all things together for good. The time came for me to choose whether I was going to take a church or not. My husband still did not have a job, so I chose to take that church, and I went to work full-time and had to leave my baby in my husband's care. But you know what? In ways that I could never have dreamed, never have imagined, never have looked forward to, God worked things out for good. I served an amazing and wonderful church. I went on to have a second and a third child. My husband was able to stay home and be their primary caregiver, which gave us the flexibility to parent and to work and to love one another the way that we had always wanted to. While he was taking care of them, he was able to go back to school and got not only an undergraduate degree, but also a graduate degree. These are things that we never would have thought possible back when I was praying so fervently for my own desires. God had another plan, another way. God had not forgotten me. God did not close God's ears, but instead God was working things out for good. It was the greatest of miracles, the ability to trust and to wait and to know that God is always present. For this we can say, thanks be to God. Amen.